It's not something that the schools should be involved in. They're there for their education, for facilitating education, for ensuring access to classrooms. They are not there to work for public health. And that's ultimately what's happening here.
All across Ontario, school children are being coerced by medical officers of health with threats of withholding their education unless parents submit to mandated surveillance of their private, personal medical information. I've reported extensively on this topic at stopvaccinecoercion.com, from addressing Toronto Public Health's privacy-violating vaccination clinics in schools to seeking clarification from the Ministry of Education on discrepancies in these student suspensions, privacy protections for medical records, and guidance for preventing arbitrary suspensions. The ministry obviously ignored my inquiries. Now, the first piece of legislation involved is the Immunization of School Pupils Act, which mandates students be vaccinated for what is referred to as designated diseases, otherwise known as illnesses, or provide a legally binding exemption affidavit attesting to questionable risks of being unvaccinated, which is stored, solicited, and tracked in Ontario's Panorama digital database, prone to breaches, hacks, and leaks, with health data especially deemed a hot commodity. Now, the ISPA states that the local medical officer of health may require a person who operates a school to suspend, and that's typically the principal, but it does not grant the medical officer of health direct authority to impose a suspension. When the principal does suspend a student, it must be in accordance with the Education Act, which sets clear rules and regulations for suspension offenses. Now, the current 20-day suspensions for alleged non-compliance with ISPA are typically reserved for severe offenses like assault or drug trafficking, not for failing to sign a vulnerable digital record. Even still, it can be said that PIPA, which is the Personal Health Information Protection Act, supersedes all of this. It clearly states that the collection, use, or disclosure of personal health information must not be obtained through deception or coercion. And what's more coercive than finding out your children have been segregated from their classes over a suspension order until you comply? That's exactly what happened to Christina Fernandez, who is a parent within the Waterloo District School Board. She joins me to share how she navigated the complexities of suspension orders tied to these public health diktats dating back to March of last year in 2024. Fernandez discusses the emotional toll this took on her family, the challenges of communication with school authorities, and the broader implications for things like parental rights and civil liberties in existing public systems, such as education. Fernandez compiled a more detailed summary of her experience, including screenshots of communication and recorded conversations, in 2 parts on her Substack, Empower. She believes the issue stemmed from a major data breach in 2022, further highlighting why parents want to protect their medical records, since there had been no changes to her children's medical data, which she relayed to the school. When this wasn't sufficient, Fernandez was told to escalate concerns that her principal was unable to answer with the superintendent. But despite attempts at finding reasonable remedies weeks ahead of her suspension deadline, Fernandez ultimately let the principal know that she would not be complying with the ISPA.
And so I let them know that very honorably. I won't be complying, and I'm not going to be doing any of these things. So let me know what do we do from here? Because I need to make sure that my children have access to their education, that have access to the facilitation of their education, that they have access to their classrooms and their peers. We need to make sure that all of this is happening. Let me know what I can do so that we can avoid, any of that moving forward. I did that. I tried to work as honorably as I could with that. So she actually, my principal delegated the task to the superintendent or sent me to the superintendent, send the issue to the superintendent. Right away, we're talking about setting up a meeting. So this was around March 7th, right? And so, her admin had messaged me about setting up a meeting for March 26th. And that's the deadline. So at 3:30. So So right away I messaged her back saying, this isn't going to fly. I'm not sure how you think this is appropriate. And again, go to the Substack to see the details on. I have all of the emails on there as well. And then the superintendent misses our appointment on March 26th at 3:30. So I said, well, I guess the next day is when the suspension was supposed to take effect. I guess we're just going to school, because I don't know what else I can do that's honorable. And so we went on and got a phone call and I also sent an email, which was very important, because since I haven't heard back and I did everything I believe possible to avoid any circumstance that would take my child out of the classroom or deny them access, whatever, I specified all the things I did, still haven't heard back. The appointments, my phone appointment was missed. So I will be sending my kids to school. I remember getting the phone call in the morning saying, hey, Christina. And, she was kind about it, like my principal. So that the kids can't be here because you didn't sign an affidavit and you didn't. And so I remember the walk to the school and just feeling so demoralized. I felt like I was coerced. I felt like I didn't have any other choice. It just felt so wrong. And I thought the answer, because it was kind of like if they end up suspending them or end up taking them out of the class, then it's easy. I'm just going to deregister them. That's it. And then I realized that wasn't my job. That wasn't what I had to do. Like, deregistering them would be like good riddance. We don't have to deal with this anymore. I realized I had to stay and I had to fight. And what was really frustrating for me was that my kids were in the middle of this. I ended up talking to the principal and saying, this isn't okay. And we had a great conversation. And I outlined that again in the Substack. I'm very transparent about all of this. Well, ultimately, to keep a long story short, is that I did take them. And on the way back up, I realized they're using our kids as pawns. Like, they're using, actually, and I did say this to the principal too. I said, you're using our kids as pawns. Like, that nobody's going to care more for my children than me and my husband. And so the government knows that, the institutions know that, and if they want us to do something, just put some pressure, right? Put some pressure, and the pressure that we want to take off our kids. Right? And so just sign on the dotted line.
When Fernandez was given the runaround, which ultimately resulted in her children being placed in a segregated space and excluded from their classrooms, that's when she received a phone call from her principal on March 27th.
When I got the phone call from the principal saying, you got to come pick up your kids. And I said, but I don't. And we've talked about this. Like, I don't have to pick up my kids. I would be voluntarily picking up my kids, just like you're voluntarily asking me to. This was the coercion part, because when she called and said, you have to pick up my kids here, I'm thinking, no, I don't. And they're in their classroom and they just need to continue. But then she said to me, well, they're here I was like, where are they? And she said that they're in a space by themselves, just the two of them. And I said, you mean to tell me that my kids are they're not in their classrooms. They're just waiting for me to pick them up. So basically they know, because you've told them, you have to wait here until your parents come pick you up. They don't know what's happening in between. They don't know the correspondence happening. And they're just waiting, and they're wondering, where are my parents? When are they going to come get me? So it's kind of like, what do I do? What do I do, right? And again, that's when they're using those children as pawns to get what they want. So when the conversation took place about what we were going to do the next day, and my son said, well, I guess we just go back. But do you understand what that means? You understand you might be taken from your class? Oh, no, I don't want to go back if I'm taken from my classroom. And so we actually had to talk about how you have to understand the consequence, right? We have, civil disobedience comes with consequence, right? We just need to know what that is, and is it worth it? And you get to decide whether or not it's worth it. And so when we talked about that, okay, but do you understand what this means? I can't control what they do in the school, right? I can only control what I request or what I tell them this ought to happen. And so you would think that if I said, if you decide to remove them from their classroom, make sure you call us, we'll come. And so then basically they're taking them out when it's time to go home, right? And they're never being put into a segregated space again.
After sending that request in an email and dropping her older son off at school the next day, Fernandez finally received a call from the superintendent.
On my way home from dropping them off, I immediately got a phone call from the superintendent. Finally got a phone call from the superintendent. And then we had a conversation, which my youngest son was able to listen to, which was tremendous. And that's also on the Substack. I have that conversation there for people to listen to. And ultimately, that's it. Like that day, I still didn't know what was going to happen. And you'll see that, you'll hear that in the voice clip, because the superintendent was saying, well, if you do bring them, they will be put into a segregated class. I said, wait a second, are you telling me, because now it's been 2 hours, it's been 2 hours since my kid's been at school, are you telling me that he's been in a segregated space when I told him he is not going to be in a segregated space? Is this so he loses trust in me? Like, what's going on here? And why haven't I been notified that he's in a segregated space right now? And she's like, well, I'm not sure. And I was like, okay, I'm glad. So at this point, we still didn't even know what was happening that day. And so my son and I went to go pick up my oldest from school. And I said, how was the day? And he's like, it was great, Mom. They didn't say anything. And I said, did they put you in a space by yourself? And he's like, no, they didn't say anything. I was in the classroom the whole time. They were able to see both sides. You know, one was in the classroom standing up and saying, no, I'm not going to back down. And then the other was able to witness that conversation and that exchange that happened with the superintendent. And it was a tremendous learning for them. And I think for a lot of parents that we can do this, like we can all do this, right? Practice our civil rights for sure.
The key lesson Fernandez learned through this experience is that public health should stay in its lane.
If it's a public health issue, it's a public health issue. And that's what I ultimately ended up saying to the superintendent. You know what? I think if you want to help me out, you're in compliance. You've done everything that you were told to do. I'm not complying with this. So now I'm a public health issue, right? It's not a school issue. It's not something that the schools should be involved in. They're there for their education, for facilitating education, for ensuring access to classrooms. They are not there to work for public health. And that's ultimately what's happening here. And I really hope that teachers and staff start to think about that and understand that. That it is two separate lanes, and they ought to be, and for parents, for them to understand their rights. These are our liberties. Like we can't just stand idle and comply to things that we know are wrong. And so that's what I would say to parents. And we all have responsibility. That's the big one too, is that we start taking more accountability for ourselves and our lives and protecting our free will and our liberties.
This entire experience highlights the alarming overreach of public health into the education system, where coercive tactics like segregating healthy, innocent children and threatening suspension of students for noncompliance with health record disclosure undermines parental rights and privacy. Fernandez's story drives home the urgent need for clear legislative boundaries, proper communication, and the protection of personal medical information, as has been the case with infections like hepatitis B and AIDS. For Rebel News, I'm Tamara Ugolini. If you agree that these coercive measures need to end and that medical privacy should be upheld, please visit stopvaccinecoercion.com, and at that website you can put your name to our petition. That's stopvaccinecoercion.com.